terror. There are places that seem to carry a strange loneliness, as if time itself had stopped within them. During the day, everything appears normal, but at night, when all movement disappears and only the echo of your own footsteps remains, the feeling changes. It was in a place like this that I started working, thinking it would be just another quiet shift, but over time, I realized that there was something there, something that didn't make sense, something that no one could explain. Good evening. My name is Richard, and I want to share an experience that left me unsettled for a long time. Maybe it was all in my head, but to this day, whenever I remember it, I feel that strange chill all over again. I started working as a night security guard in a partially abandoned commercial building in downtown Chicago. To be honest, I never liked the night shift. The building was massive, but only a few floors were still in use, while the rest had been deserted for years. At first I thought it would be an easy job. After all, who would want to break into an almost empty place? But within the first few days, I noticed something strange with the elevators. The panels seemed to light up and move on their own, especially in the middle of the night. The feeling of standing there, watching the display show floors that weren't supposed to be in use always gave me chills. No one entered or left, and yet the elevator would go up and down, eventually opening its doors on the ground floor, without a single living soul inside. One of the older janitors told me this was normal, that sometimes electrical failures caused it. But I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in the air. It was as if every time those doors opened, something invisible was either entering or leaving. And yet, there was never any record of a human presence. As the weeks passed, other things started making me uneasy. Sometimes, while monitoring the security cameras, I would see strange shadows moving through the hallways of the empty floors. But when I went to check in person, I found nothing but corridors that smelled of dust and mold. One night in particular, I swore I saw a shadow standing in front of one of the glass doors on the 7th floor, but when I got there, the place was completely deserted. The security guard who worked the previous shift told me about strange noises coming from inside the walls, rustling sounds as if something was moving within them. But he also said that none of this was new, and that in time I would get used to it. The most disturbing thing was that, after he said that, I felt as if the whole building was watching me, as if it was waiting for my reaction. The silence was heavy, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Even so, I tried to stay professional, pretending it didn't affect me, but things escalated when I started hearing a voice over my radio, always calling me by name. At first, I thought it was a co-worker trying to mess with me, but the voice didn't sound like anyone I knew. It called out, "Richard," in a slow, almost suffering tone, and always in the middle of the night. I asked the other security guards if anyone had been trying to talk to me, but they all swore they had no idea what I was talking about. They even laughed, saying that maybe the building was playing tricks on me. When I told one of the older janitors, he just shook his head and said that a lot of strange things had happened there. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but the worried look in his eyes stayed with me. I started sleeping poorly, waking up drenched in sweat from nightmares I could never fully remember. A week later, I made the unfortunate decision to check the top floor, the one where the security cameras always showed flickering lights. The janitor had warned me that the floor had been locked for years because no one was interested in renovating it. Still, I felt a strange curiosity, almost like a call that wouldn't leave me alone. Then, after hearing that same voice call my name on the radio again, I decided to go up. Saved everything on a flash drive and locked it away, hoping that putting some distance between myself and those recordings would help me move on. But ever since that night, I've never felt truly alone. Even now, I sometimes get the feeling that something is watching me, following me. Maybe it's just paranoia. Maybe it's my mind playing tricks on me after everything I experienced. But every time I hear a faint ding or catch the scent of mold in the air, my heart races, and for a split second, I feel like I'm right back in that building again. And to this day, no one has given me a convincing explanation for what happened there. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the upcoming stories. Your support means everything. Now, let's continue. My name is Isabella Carter, and this is the story of how moving into a new house became the worst mistake of our lives. My mother, Stella, had always dreamed of a spacious home, a place where my younger brother Samuel and I would have plenty of room, far from the noise and chaos of the city. So, when she found an old house on the outskirts of Denver in a neighborhood worn down by time, she didn't hesitate to convince us that this would be the perfect new beginning. The house had a peculiar grandeur, with recently restored walls and large windows that opened to a view of the mountains. Surrounded by thick bushes and connected to the rest of the city by a dirt road, it exuded the peace my mother had always longed for. However, from the moment we arrived, something felt off. On the first night, while we were still unpacking boxes, a noise from the roof made me freeze. Someone or something was walking on the tiles. My father, Henry, grabbed a flashlight and went to check. He came back with no answers. "It's probably just cats," he muttered, trying to sound calm. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't ignore the way his hand trembled slightly as he lowered the flashlight. Hours later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My room was at the very end of the corridor, and the steps stopped exactly at my door. I held my breath, waiting for my mom or dad to say something, but there was only silence. As the days passed, the sense of unease intensified. One afternoon, while Samuel was playing in the living room, a sharp noise came from the kitchen. When we entered, we found a shattered glass on the floor. There was no one there. "It must have been the wind," my mother murmured, even though the window was shut. But the strangest things happened with objects around the house. A framed family photo I had carefully placed on the shelf was found face down the next morning. The day after, it was on the floor with no explanation. "Just a coincidence," my father insisted, though his expression betrayed his attempt at reassurance. Things got worse one night when the temperature suddenly dropped. I woke up shivering, watching my own breath form mist in the air, as if we were in the middle of a brutal winter. I got up to get a glass of water and found Samuel standing by the living room window, completely still. "What are you doing awake?" I asked. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the darkness outside. "There's someone out there," he whispered, pointing. I looked. All I saw were shadows shifting in the wind. I took him back to bed, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Not long after, the voices began. It was like someone was whispering near my ear, low, irregular murmurs. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Until one night during dinner, we all heard it. A woman's voice, clear, distinct. The sound lingered in the air, sending chills down my spine. My mother dropped her knife, the metal clattering onto the floor. My father shot up from his chair, searching the room for any device that could have played that sound. But as you can probably guess, there was nothing. No television, no radio. Just that eerie whisper vibrating through the walls, as if the house was breathing with us. My father tried to dismiss the tension by turning up the music, filling the house with familiar noise. But it didn't help. The air felt heavy, dense, as if something invisible was watching us. Things became even stranger the day I found an old doll in the storage room. It was covered in dust, its faded blue eyes staring blankly, its dress torn and worn. The moment I touched it, a shiver ran down my spine. Where did this come from? I asked, feeling a deep unease. My mother frowned, looking just as surprised as I was. "Leave it there," she said. I took her advice and abandoned it in the attic. But that night, I dreamed of the doll. In my dream, it sat at the edge of my bed, its lifeless eyes fixed on me. I woke up with a jolt, my heart racing, certain that someone had been in my room. And that's when I realized we were not alone. It was never just a haunted house. It was something much worse, something alive, something ancient, something that fed on fear itself. And as much as we had escaped, I sometimes wonder, did we truly leave it behind? Or did a part of it follow us? Even now, in the dead of night when the apartment is silent and safe, I swear I can still hear it. A whisper, a shadow, shifting in the corner of my vision. A fleeting presence, watching, waiting. Because some things never let go, and some nightmares never end. Good evening, friends. My name is Emily, I'm 29 years old, and I've been working as a nurse for almost 7 years. When I received the news that I had been accepted at a prestigious hospital in New York, I was so happy that I could barely hold back my tears. I had spent years searching for an opportunity in a renowned institution where I could learn more and grow professionally. My family had always supported me, but I felt that I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of taking this important step in my career. The moment I set foot in the hospital, the atmosphere of clean hallways and state-of-the-art equipment filled me with hope. It felt like I had finally arrived at the place I had always dreamed of. On my very first day, I was welcomed by my new supervisor, Susan, who led me to the emergency department where I would be stationed. She had a polite smile, but there was something strange about her gaze, an unusual coldness that was difficult to explain. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. I simply assumed it was the stress of the job. My colleagues seemed quiet, around her always looking down or appearing anxious. Still, I chose to focus on my work and show dedication, as that was my way of earning respect and trust. Deep down, I believed that by being a committed professional, everything would go smoothly. As the first few weeks went by, I got used to the hospital's routine and gained the trust of several patients. I always enjoyed chatting with them while administering medication or changing dressings, asking simple questions like, "Are you comfortable?" or "How was your night?" These small gestures build trust, and to me, being a nurse is much more than just following protocols. It's about caring for people when they are at their most vulnerable. However, I noticed that my way of working caught Susan's attention in a way I couldn't quite understand. Sometimes I would catch her watching me from a distance, unblinking, which left me with an unsettling feeling. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. At first, it was small things, patient charts disappearing even though I was absolutely sure I had placed them in the right spot. On other occasions, I would arrive for my shift only to find that my schedule had been changed without any prior notice, making me look irresponsible in front of the team. I tried to talk to Susan, but she always denied any knowledge of it, wearing that same cold gaze and a subtle smile that felt laced with sarcasm. I did my best to stay calm, but deep inside, I knew there was a clear intention behind these so-called accidents. I struggled to prevent these minor acts of sabotage from affecting my confidence, but they slowly started disrupting my routine. Every time I noticed an error in a patient file or found a piece of equipment misplaced, that same suspicion crept in. Susan was behind it all. In the hallways, some colleagues avoided eye contact with me as if they were afraid of being seen, talking to me. The few who did speak to me would drop hints, saying things like, "Just keep your head down if you don't want trouble." I couldn't understand how someone could thrive on the fear of others, but I was beginning to realize that was exactly what was happening. The feeling that I was walking on eggshells kept growing, and my sleep started to suffer. By my third week at the hospital, I began experiencing frequent headaches, so bad that they interfered with my shifts. Nothing worked. Not painkillers, not cold compresses. Sometimes I had to lean against the medication counter, taking deep breaths just to endure the pain. The atmosphere in the department seemed heavier whenever Susan was around, and I couldn't deny that I started associating my migraines with her presence. At night, I couldn't sleep properly. Even when I was exhausted, I would toss and turn, replaying every moment of the day in my head, double-checking that I hadn't made any mistakes. Yet the errors kept appearing, even though I was triple-checking everything. From time to time, Susan would call me into her office with a tone of fake concern to tell me I had made mistakes. But I knew I hadn't. I had checked, double-checked, and even asked a colleague to confirm. Everything was correct. But still, Susan acted as if I had made a mistake, this time though something inside me snapped. The exhaustion, the frustration, the months of pent-up stress, all of it boiled over at once. Before I even realized it, my voice echoed through the department. "Enough, Susan. I know exactly what you're doing." Her cold eyes flickered with a brief shadow of surprise, but her expression quickly returned to that same subtle, smug smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Emily. Maybe you're just tired." Tired? Oh, absolutely. Tired of being sabotaged. Tired of watching you manipulate the staff with fear. And you know what's worse? You're not just hurting me. You're hurting everyone here. They're afraid of you, and you thrive on that. A heavy silence spread across the room. I saw some co-workers look away, but for the first time, I also saw one or two finally lift their heads. For a second, I thought Susan would respond with her usual icy demeanor, but I noticed something different. Discomfort. She held my gaze for a few seconds before letting out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. For the first time since I had started working there, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't intimidated by her blank stares or her subtle smirks. I wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone anymore. What had once felt like weakness now became a matter of survival. I had decided I was leaving. The following week, I planned to submit my resignation. But before I even had the chance to hand in my letter, something unexpected happened. A patient died during a routine surgical procedure, and suddenly rumors started spreading like wildfire. Tension filled the hospital like a thick fog, and I immediately knew something was off about the situation. Word got around that there had been a serious medical error, either in the prescription or administration of a medication. but whispers in the hallway suggested that the real problem had been Susan's supervision, that she had made last-minute changes or ignored an important warning. Within 24 hours, an internal investigation was launched, and hospital administration decided to suspend Susan while they sorted things out. The news spread through the building like wildfire, and I will never forget the strange mix of relief and dread I felt. Relief because the person who had tormented me was finally gone. Dread because a human life had been lost, something irreversible. That night, I went home exhausted, my mind racing. But for the first time in weeks, I was able to sleep. No nightmares, no waking up with a throbbing headache. The weight on my chest had started to fade. The next morning, I woke up with no pain at all, as if my body had finally been granted permission to rest. It was almost surreal. The insomnia, the migraines, that suffocating feeling of drowning in my own thoughts. All of it was gone. For a brief moment, I even wondered if I was dreaming, but no. The truth was, Susan's presence alone had been poisoning me, physically and mentally, and I was horrified by how quickly everything seemed to resolve itself after she left. It's terrifying to realize how much power one person can have over our health, both mental and physical. Even now, I don't know exactly how to feel about everything that happened, but I felt like I had to share this experience because people in workplaces like this can damage us in ways we never imagined. For now, I've decided to stay at the hospital for the sake of my patients. But when I look back, I shudder just remembering everything I went through. Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, comment the time you're watching this. I love knowing who sticks around until the very end. All right, let's continue. There are places that, no matter how welcoming they may seem at first glance, hold an atmosphere that is difficult to explain. Sometimes it's nothing. Other times it's just that unsettling feeling that we try to ignore. But what happens when small details start to add up? When something inside you insists that something is wrong, even without a clear reason? You can't always explain it, but you can feel it. Good evening. I was never one to believe in these things, but what I experienced in that apartment made me question a lot. I need to share this story, to try to understand if it was all in my head or if there was something more going on. My name is Sarah. I'm 31 years old, and when all of this happened, I had just moved into a new apartment. My husband, James, and I were looking for a more affordable place, and when we found this old property in Boston, we were thrilled. The neighborhood was so quiet that it felt almost too peaceful, more than we were used to. The first thing that felt odd about that building, I attributed to the musty smell in the hallways and the creaking wooden floors under my feet. James didn't notice anything. He was only thinking about how much money we'd save and how practical it would be to live close to work. The truth is, deep down, I convinced myself it was an opportunity too good to pass up. It was a spacious apartment with 2 bedrooms, a large living room, and a kitchen with a bright window overlooking the internal courtyard. I held on to the idea that it could be our fresh start, far from the noise and stress of the big city. The first few weeks were as peaceful as I had imagined, almost boring. I managed to arrange all the furniture in the right places and even gave the walls a fresh coat of paint in light, cozy colors. I love decorating, so I spent my days buying ornaments, paintings, and lamps to make our place feel more welcoming. During those moments, I occasionally noticed a curious gaze coming from the window above ours, but I chose to ignore it. Later, I discovered that an old woman named Mrs. Holloway lived there. She rarely came downstairs, and according to the few neighbors I met, she didn't like to talk. I didn't worry too much about her. I always believed that elderly people have their own habits and routines. What really started to bother me were the anonymous notes that began appearing in my mailbox. Strange messages like, "You shouldn't be here." At first I thought it was just a bad joke, but it brought back that uneasy feeling I had on the first day. I talked to James about the notes, but he was skeptical. "You shouldn't let these silly things get to you," he said, shaking his head. I understood his point of view, but it was hard to ignore the strangeness of it all, especially when it was coming from the very people who lived around us, and in a place that was supposed to be so quiet. My daily routine started to feel heavier. I felt watched all the time, and even considered installing security cameras. However, our finances were tight, and the rent was already a burden, so I dismissed the idea and simply made sure to lock all doors and windows properly. That was when something inside me began to change. I started suffering from insomnia, tossing and turning in bed for hours before I could finally sleep. And when I did, nightmares haunted me, always placing me in dark rooms with the feeling of being suffocated by something I couldn't see. When I woke up, my heart would be racing, and I'd find myself breathless and drenched in sweat, as if I had truly lived through the experience. James, on the other hand, slept deeply and never noticed anything strange. The nights became a torment, and during the day I felt drained, unable to focus on even the simplest household tasks. I started losing hair, which left me desperate. I had always been vain and took good care of my appearance. My hair was falling out in clumps, whether in the shower or even when I ran my fingers lightly through it. To make things worse, my skin turned pale, and I constantly felt weak, with a dizziness that had no apparent explanation. I went to the doctor several times, did blood tests, and nothing abnormal was found. That only made me even more anxious. I couldn't explain it rationally, but I was sure of one thing. Somehow, that apartment seemed to be rejecting me. It was as if the walls were heavy, carrying an energy that was feeding off my vitality. It didn't take long before I began to suspect that Mrs. Holloway was the one leaving the notes. One day I decided to go upstairs to try and talk to her, to clear things up. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered, even though I was sure I had heard the sound of shuffling footsteps approaching the door. I insisted, knocking a few more times with my knuckles, but nothing. The hallway was drowned in an unsettling silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I eventually felt ridiculous standing there and decided to head back down, but as I reached my floor, I had the eerie impression that I heard her doorknob turning slightly, like someone was peeking through the crack of the door. The feeling of being constantly watched intensified. On the rare occasions I went out to buy groceries or go to the pharmacy, I felt eyes on me, like silent warnings trying to push me away. I tried to keep my head up and ignore it, but my anxiety grew with every new note left in my mailbox. One of those restless nights, I heard noises coming from the floor above, heavy, dragging footsteps, followed by a kind of murmuring sound. I woke up startled and immediately grabbed my phone to check the time. It was just past 3 a.m. Normally, I would have brushed it off as old plumbing or my imagination, but this time it felt too real. James was still sound asleep beside me, breathing peacefully. I nudged him, hoping he'd wake up and help me figure out what was going on. But he just groaned, turned over in bed, and muttered something about being too tired. I decided to get up and go to the living room. Maybe if I looked out the window, I could see if there were any lights on in Mrs. Holloway's apartment. Nothing. The building was in total darkness. I returned to the bedroom, but an eerie sensation crept over me, as if something was watching my every move, but refusing to reveal itself. As the days passed, besides the nightmares, I started experiencing anxiety attacks that left me feeling paranoid. My body was deteriorating more and more. My face was hollowing out, and even climbing the building stairs left me gasping for air. To avoid the exhaustion, I began using the elevator, even though I hated that slow, creaky metal box. One afternoon, while coming back from the market, I stepped into the elevator and felt a sudden chill. It was an overwhelming sense that someone was standing behind me, even though the cabin was completely empty. I even heard the faint sound of fingers snapping near my ear, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. It was maddening, because I could no longer tell what was just my imagination and what was real. James still didn't notice anything unusual, which only made me feel more alone and insecure. In an attempt to distract myself, I went back to painting watercolor on the balcony and started watching light-hearted TV shows, hoping to shift my mind away from the dark atmosphere surrounding me. But even the paint dried strangely, forming blotches that reminded me of distorted